Welcome to Daily Dose of Aramaic. This is Lesson 9, in which we will be discussing suffix pronouns. And more information on this topic can be found in Biblical Aramaic for Biblical Interpreters, pages 60 to 71. This lesson follows upon discussion of independent pronouns in the previous lesson. And so, just as we did with independent pronouns, we're going to place each of the suffix pronouns forms on a table listed off by person, gender, and number. So first we want to notice the grayed out cells. These represent forms that do not appear in the Bible. These forms with their vocalizations are reconstructed from Aramaic of the time outside the Bible. We also want to notice in the bottom right the first person common singular forms. They happen to be the same as in Biblical Hebrew. Then we want to focus on the fact that each of these cells has a type 1 suffix pronoun on the right and a type 2 on the left. Type 2 has as its special feature the red yod. Now that yod is going to tell us something that's useful for interpretation in some cases. So it really pays off to become familiar with type 1 suffix pronouns and then remember that the type 2 ones, which are very similar in their spellings, have as a difference with the type 1 the fact that there's a yod there. And then the last comment we want to make on this table has to do with the third person masculine plural suffix pronouns. In Ezra, there are some variant forms where Ezra places a mem in place of that final noon. Okay. Suffix pronouns attach to certain parts of speech. The first we've already talked about when we covered the particle of existence. That was when a suffix pronoun is attached to the there is or there are idea of the particle of existence, it functions as the subject of a nominal clause. So because we've covered that already, we can move on to prepositions, and after prepositions we'll follow with 3 to 6, so the rest of the items in this list. So let's get on with prepositions now. This form is familiar from our Hebrew studies, isn't it? It's a bait preposition with a first-person common singular suffix pronoun. So this means in or with me. So this is very familiar from Hebrew. No problem. Let's move on. Here in Hebrew, we have this form where it's the min preposition, and we sort of have to remember that there's that other mem there with the dagesh in it. And remember that it's the min preposition. So this would be from you, the second person masculine singular suffix pronoun in Biblical Hebrew. Well, what about Biblical Aramaic? The same idea is represented with this form, where min keeps its noon, and the suffix pronoun is spelled differently for second person masculine singular. We can't import our intuition that a kaf with a shavah in it is the second feminine singular suffix pronoun for two reasons. Firstly, second feminine singular suffix pronoun does not exist in the Bible. But secondly, this is the correct spelling for the second masculine singular suffix pronoun. Now, here's some other prepositions. Before you and after you. So, what's different here? What's different is that these prepositions are preferentially taking type 2 suffixes. Before you, masculine plural, and after you, masculine plural. That's just what these prepositions do. Now, it's not going to make an interpretive difference which set of suffix pronouns a given preposition takes, but it just helps to remember that certain prepositions prefer one system over the other. Let's move on to nouns. Nouns that attach suffix pronouns are expressing possession or kinship through use of that suffix pronoun. Let's see what we mean. Daniel 2:6 is going to provide the background to discussion of this matter, so let's look at it briefly. Gifts and a reward and great honor you will receive from me. So the first word is a feminine plural noun, and we know this with the comets noon suffix. And the white highlighted word is a feminine singular noun, which we see from the comets hey suffix. So if this is some sort of formula, what we see here is gifts and a reward, both feminine words, but the first one's a plural, the second is singular. And that's common to see from these forms, not hard at all. And if a given modern language Bible translation says gifts and rewards and great honor you will receive from me. It's just departing from the literal grammatical meaning of that singular word, a reward. Well, let's look at Daniel 5:17 now. Different story, of course, in the book of Daniel. Let your gifts be for you and give your rewards to another, is how it normally reads in modern translations. So the first word, your gifts, where's the yod we would expect for type 2 suffix? It's not there. So our normal rule, which we've inherited from Hebrew, is that if we have the suffix pronoun without the yod, the noun is singular. If we have the suffix pronoun with the yod, the noun is plural. This is the exception in Biblical Aramaic. Feminine nouns with a comet's hay suffix only take type 1 suffixes. That's important because we can no longer depend on there being a yod there to know whether it's a feminine singular or feminine plural noun. But have no fear, biblical interpreters. We actually do have a means at hand to determine whether we're dealing with a feminine singular noun that has the comet's hay ending or a feminine plural noun that in its singular form would have the comet's hay ending, other than looking at the suffix pronoun. And what is it? Well, firstly, of course, in Daniel 5:17, we have context. So we have subject-verb agreement for the let your gifts be for you part. But and that's just because it's a subject, the gifts there. However, the rewards are the object. Give your rewards to another. So within Daniel 5:17, we need to look elsewhere other than subject-verb agreement to help us. Should this indeed be plural, your rewards? Well, let's look at these vowels, comets right there. What significance do they have? Let's go back to some principles. If you remember when we talked about the various states of nouns, we talked about there's an absolute state, of course, and then the construct state, which can affect, of course, both consonants and vowels. We're interested in the feminine singular construct and the feminine plural construct. Note that both of them have a tav ending, but they have different vowels preceding that tav. The patach in the case of the feminine singular construct and the comets in the case of the feminine plural construct. So let's look at Daniel 4:24 to show how we really can depend on this vowel difference to determine the proper number of that feminine noun that has the comet's hay ending. So in the yellow, once again, I'm showing a plural. So your iniquities, you see that? And then with white, I am pointing out, once again, this is a singular, your prosperity. Both of them have the second masculine singular suffix ending. Notice that comets, as we have seen before, is mirroring the comet's tav ending we expect for a feminine plural construct form. And this shava is reflecting the patah tav that we would have had for a feminine singular construct, and it just would have been more clear if we didn't have that suffix pronoun attached. Okay, so in this case, in the case that I've frosted with white, we see that patah has reduced to a shava due to the vowel reduction we expect in this kind of case when we're adding the suffix pronoun. Well, what if a suffix pronoun attaches to a verb? This is one of the ways for Biblical Aramaic to express the object of a verb. Now, we've already seen other ways, right? Where the lamed could be the direct object marker. There is actually a dedicated direct object marker that only appears once, yat, yod tav. And then the third person masculine plural independent pronoun can function in an object designating sense. But here's another way for a pronoun to be an object, and that is to attach it, just as is done in Hebrew, to the end of a verb as a suffix. So I've put in red nun hirik yod as being the same as in Hebrew. So if we're familiar with that suffix as in Hebrew, we can use that for our biblical interpretation. And there are similarities otherwise, but let's remember there are definitely differences as well. And the double dashes show that not a lot of these forms are necessarily attested in the Bible or elsewhere. Okay, now let's also look at third masculine singular, third feminine singular. Notice both of those have hey with mapik. So we need to pay attention to, of course, context, but also the vowel used to determine, is this a him or a her object for the verb. And then there's a form with an energic noon. Why did I put that there? Well, we'll find out. So you'll notice each of those forms has another noon in there that's not present in the other form. Okay, so just remember that. We'll come back to that idea. So look at this. On the top, a perfect verb. I've chosen the same verbal root to try to illustrate this point we want to make about the energic noon. The matter of the king, you, masculine singular, have caused us to know. So we haven't talked about verbs yet, but you can see with my over-literal translation of a causative that we're talking about something that's similar to the hifil in Hebrew. So what we want to look at right now, of course, is the suffix. Okay, and so that's the first person common plural suffix, the na there. All right, so caused us to know. So that's an object stuck on the end of a perfect verb. So now we look at the bottom. You, masculine plural, will not cause me to know. So similar idea. We've got a different subject here. We have got a different object here. But it's still the know verb, the yod dalet ayin, and this will help us illustrate a point. So we see in red, that's the main verb idea, right? You, masculine plural, will not cause. And then the me that we see in black and now white, that's designated by the suffix pronoun. But what do we notice that's different between the perfect verb when it's attaching a suffix pronoun and the imperfect? Well, might be a little hard to see. It's a detail, but it's that energic noon. And what you see on the screen is the shurik vav noon at the end of that imperfect verb. That is part of second person masculine plural imperfect for a verb form. So the first noon, if you will, is part of actually that verb form. And then the noon in white has to do with the first common singular suffix. So then we just need to explain what's that dagesh doing in the first noon. So there are three noons packed together there. Well, that's the energic noon. And I'm pointing this out because in biblical Hebrew, some imperfect verbs take an energic noon when they're attaching a suffix. In biblical Aramaic, all imperfect verbs, when they take a suffix pronoun, have an energic noon. That's helpful. Okay, now we talk about infinitives. So let's look at the top, the objective genitive case here. Situation, to cause me to know, Daniel 2:26. So literally, because an infinitive is not a verb, it's a verbal noun, it means to cause my knowing. So that first person common singular suffix is acting like it's attaching to a noun there. Okay, so to cause my knowing. It's called an objective genitive because if we're translating this and understanding this more as a verb idea, to cause me to know sounds more verb-like in English. We just need to keep in mind it's to cause me. It's not the me, not the first common singular that's carrying out the action. Okay, so it's the object of the knowing action. Not the same is the case on the bottom, the so-called subjective genitive reading of attaching the suffix pronoun to an infinitive. Look at that. And when he approached. Okay, so you have the kof resh bait verbal root, and then the tzere, and then the hey with the mapik, designated third person masculine singular suffix pronoun. So literally it's and when his approaching happened. I'm supplying the happened idea. Okay, so the he, the third person masculine singular, is carrying out this approaching action. So it's the subject of that action that the infinitive is naming as a verbal noun. Okay, so a way of saying this and trying to be precise with grammar is to say that the situation on the top, that suffix pronoun is acting as an objective genitive. It's the object of the verbal action that the infinitive is naming. And then on the bottom, we have a case of a subjective genitive where the suffix pronoun is expressing the agent, in the case of active voice, right, of the verb idea. It's the subject. And finally, talking about participles, there's actually only one case of distinguishing between a singular participle and a plural participle with this suffix pronoun. So notice it's, of course, the same verse. There's a cative carre difference. So on the top is a reading with the carre tradition of a singular participle idea. So I'm going to put this in yellow. My Lord, let the dream be for the one, singular, who hates you. Now, why do I emphasize the one? Well, let's look at the bottom for the plural participle. My Lord, let the dream be for those who hate you. So there's a yod that's actually written. And so the cative says this is a plural participle here. And that yod needs to jump out to us. And then, of course, we compare what's on the bottom with what's on the top. We see that that yod is the consonant difference that the cative has. So we would need to take into account context to decide what's more likely the original reading. But the cative carre happens to be the only place that the difference between a type 1 and type 2, that is to say singular and plural situation, manifests itself. So the singular participle takes type 1, plural participle type 2. There's the yod. Okay. Now, on one hand, it might seem that the suffix pronouns we just covered, that this was really complicated, but it's not. We need to remember type 1 and type 2 suffix pronouns, where type 2 has a yod. And a big difference with Hebrew that especially stands out is that the comets he, feminine singular nouns, will normally all take type 1 suffixes. So we need to pay special attention using context to figure out what's the more likely reading. Is it a feminine singular noun or a feminine plural noun? And then we could also remember that perfect verbs do not take an energic noon when they add a suffix pronoun. Imperfect verbs do. So that's just another key indicator for us that we're looking at a perfect or an imperfect. Okay? Well, it's been a pleasure sharing with you about suffix pronouns. I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.